Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm excited to be joined by Joseph Baladi. First, though, we'll start with a little bit of a housekeeping. My name is Maria. I'm from Acquia, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. As usual, today's webinar is being recorded, and I will send all attendees a link to the recording and slides in the next couple of days. Joseph will also be taking questions for about 5 to 10 minutes at the end of his presentation. So please submit any questions you might have in the Q&A tab, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. So now, if you don't know much about Acquia, I'll give you a quick introduction to who we are and what we do. Acquia is an open source digital experience company. We provide the world's most ambitious brands with technology that allows them to embrace innovation and create customer moments that matter. At Acquia, we believe in the power of community, giving our customers the freedom to build tomorrows on their terms. On that note, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Joseph Baladi. Joseph is a marketer, consultant, speaker, author, and lecturer. He has lived in Asia almost 20 years and has worked in virtually every Asian market. Further to the worldwide release of his hugely successful book, The Brutal Truth About Asian Branding, Joseph received the prestigious Ron Frank Fellowship to read the Executive MBA program at Singapore Management University, where he is also adjunct professor of strategic brand management. He's completing the first empirical research study on the brand purpose construct. So with the introductions done, I'll hand the mic over to Joseph to begin. Hi, Joseph.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Good afternoon to everyone who's logged on. I'm really happy with the opportunity to share some of the insights that I've collected over the last 20 odd years in my time in Asia. And as Maria mentioned, I've had the opportunity of traveling and working in every market, being based both in Japan and in Singapore. When we talk about winning in Asia, in the age of disruption, a couple of terms that probably need some attention is winning aspect and of course disruption. And winning right now is entirely dependent on better understanding landscape changes. Winning is taking place in probably the most dynamic region of the world, and that happens to be Asia. And I emphasize that because when I got back to Australia about 2 years ago, and I go back every so often to Asia, it just struck me as a little bit strange and odd just how, I think, indifferent a lot of Australian companies tend to be about the dynamism that is in Asia. So today when we talk about winning and disruption, we're going to be talking from an Asian perspective and also from a branding perspective, which is our starting point. So brands are responding to a changing world, and Asia will lead, and the world is changing dynamically. Now from a branding perspective, we need to look at brands. A good starting point is really where brands are, where they've come from, and the kind of impact that they've had, and therefore what kind of impact we can expect from an Asian version of it. It's important to look back and understand that essentially all that it is today is essentially the product of the genius of American brands over the last 70-odd, 80 years, particularly second half of the 20th century. The last century. The prosperity, the prominence of the Western world and America in particular was the result of brands that appealed, inspired, and ultimately defined people. And here we find one of the first two great insights of American business, the understanding, the recognition that brands actually have a bigger, broader role. They define people. And that was a very particularly profound insight. The second insight that really came out of the American experience, and there's a reason why I'm making the reference to the American experience, was this understanding that brands actually not only define people, but went beyond products and services. They weren't just commercial. They had a cultural impact on society. So when we talk about the impact of brands, American brands, we can better understand the emergence of what became known, and still is known, as the American century. Because the American century wasn't just made up of commercial brands like Google and Coca-Cola and Pepsi and all of those brands. They were also part of ideas, notions that people actually embraced, which made America bigger and broader than what it was. So ideas like democracy, capitalism, even entertainment, ideas like Hollywood, American movies, and ultimately also personalities like Elvis Presley and Oprah Winfrey began or created this juggernaut that became the American century and all of the associated benefits that brought to the United States. That was, and to some degree remains, the American century. So 4 points. Let me fast forward to where we are today. It's really important to try and process 4 key points that are dictating the dynamics of what's happening today as far as companies and businesses are concerned. So we've had a lot of change. Everybody understands change and how that's impacting. But the American century changed what we expected of brands, and the landscape realities of the last, say, 20, 30, 40 years are also changing expectations by consumers. Their understanding, their needs, their expectations of brands are also changing. The starting point of that change was the Cold War, but it's important to also recognize that the real drivers, the facilitators of the kind of dynamic change that we're experiencing today, disruptive change we're experiencing today, was also driven by the rise of globalization and new technology. So change is the first important aspect. I think consumer expectations have changed. What they want today is different from what it used to be, and that is something that's still a little bit essentially lost on a lot of business or brand owners, focusing on functional benefits and benefits. So how have they changed? So at the one extreme of the continuum, I think that people are beginning to scrutinize corporate conduct and expect responsibility, and we've seen a great deal of attention through corporate social responsibility initiatives that are taking place all over the world, and that's happening also in Asia. But at the other end, consumers now are also beginning to demand other things. They're looking for brands that are actually having a bigger relevance in their lives, simply beyond the functional benefits or features and elements that the products actually deliver. Increasingly, this additional relevance in life is being manifested through a construct that I would imagine most of you or some of you have heard. It's called brand purpose. And I want to talk at length about brand purpose in a moment, because it's an important dynamic emerging construct that's changing business and its impact on Asia is particular. The next element, the next key point is also this idea of Asia rising. Now that's not a new idea necessarily. We've had Asia rising forever. Since the late 20th century. In the 70s, we had the impact of Japan, both in the United States and later in the world, with its exports of consumer goods or electronic goods and motor vehicles. And now, of course, we're experiencing the rise of Asia in general, which is being the leading edge is China. And what's interesting about this is that a lot of people are labeling this the Asian century. So recall a few slides ago when I talked about the impact of the American century, which was driven by brands. So if we start talking about the emergence of an Asian century, we begin to see that if this is true, we begin to see a paradigm shifting potentiality in the offing. But when we talk about the Asian century, an Asia rising, it's not necessarily the same as the Asian century. And because the phenomenon is transforming itself at different paces, at different levels. And there are two important drivers, I guess, that are impacting this emergence of the Chinese or the Asian century. First, there is this pull from the outside, this idea that brands should have a purpose, they should have core values by consumers is becoming more relevant, it's becoming more audible. And this push from inside, and that's an important beginning element that I want to touch on, and that is the essential need for employee populations in Asia to enjoy cultures that foster innovation. And the reason I say that is because currently there is an absence of that. And again, I'll touch on to this. But just before I leave this point on culture, it's interesting because I was sitting through an academic seminar only 2 weeks ago. It was a PhD presentation, or a presentation by a PhD candidate that explored innovation through the prism of internationalization. You know, did innovation come from internationalization, or was it the other way around? And at no point in time was the issue of culture brought up, which I did at the end during the Q&A, and that kicked off a whole round of questions. And the point I'm trying to bring is that culture is such a massive issue that it continues to be not tackled in a way that makes sense for the region, and I'll explain that in a couple of seconds. So overall, essentially, all these elements together are working together and are becoming more visible at a quicker rate. So together, all of these elements are creating a cycle, and the common element that these four elements change, new consumer expectations, an Asia rising, and the potentiality of an Asian century are all basically driven out of one common denominator, people. Obviously, people means customers, consumers at the prime end, but we're also increasingly talking about the people that are entrusted to deliver on that directive, and that is employees, you know, the other stakeholders. So the idea of these two elements are becoming more and more of an issue in Asia. More companies, particularly those that are being managed by a younger, newer generation, younger entrepreneurs, are recognizing the importance of the duality of those two common audiences. Yet we have a great paradox in Asia. We talk about this rise, this elevation and importance, and there is a great paradox that that exists in the region that companies need to recognize and to be able to deal with. There's an interesting saying in Singapore, you know, same but different. So yes, there's same in terms of some of the things that are happening in Asia, but there is something different that's emerging. So on the one hand, we talk about this elevation of Asia, the rise of the Asian century, but it's important to also recognize that there are broad stroke leadership characteristics that continue to endure in the region that are actually arresting that rise. So for every 2 steps forwards, there is 1 step backwards. We talk about the emergence of Asia and the China century, but there are issues at the very top that are slowing down that process. And when I say top, I'm talking about leadership, be political, but especially business leadership. 20 years ago when I arrived in Asia, or rather when I arrived in Singapore from Japan to take on the role for a brand consultancy, I came in at the tail end of a year-long rebranding effort for a government body. I think it was the tourist commission, or the tourist board, the Singapore Tourist Board. And we were at the point of presenting final iterations of the brand strategy to the board. And there kept coming changes to the work. And I was very concerned, even though I hadn't been involved in the process, I was very concerned because, as you may all understand, by the time you get to such a phase, the work has gone through a multitude of different important milestones. Research, workshops, agreement, right down to it's filtering all the way down to the strategy that is ultimately put together. So when I pointed this out to the individual, this concern that I had, the response was very straightforward and almost matter of fact. She said to me not to worry because the government knows best and everything was under control. And that is something that struck me literally from the first week I was in Singapore. In Singapore and other countries, the government always knows best and people seem to recognize and acquiesce to that. But in a business context, the CEO rules absolutely unchallenged. And that creates obviously issues with people unwilling to challenge or question things within business environments. Why am I saying that? Because obviously that an understanding of that is important, particularly for companies that are going to set up in Asia and use local talent, but also it emerges as an opportunity to understand, once understood, to recognize. So going back to these things, we're talking about the Asian traditional role of the Asian CEO, and I'm talking more about the older generations. The situation in Asia is complex. The existence of historical, social, cultural markers translate into behavioral norms, both outside as well as inside the company. So one of the things that we need to probably recognize is that a patriarchal and hierarchical attitude by managers and CEOs tends to remind people that they should remember their place. And it doesn't really matter that Asia is so different, because whether it's driven by Confucius ethics and underpinnings in China or in Japan or in Singapore, or Islamic underpinnings in countries like Malaysia or Indonesia, or other underpinnings, the one common element that basically reflects most of Asia, with the arguable exception of India, is this hierarchical and patriarchal approach to management. And ultimately, one of the things that it obviously creates is this command control kind of environment that does in fact preclude engagement by people within the organization. And that obviously creates a number of problems. The biggest is really this issue of competitive advantage. The inability of people to feel that they can contribute does in fact create certain disadvantages, which is partly the reason why the region is replete with expatriates. This idea that people can in fact think outside of the box and are willing to take a risk. So there is a degree, an enduring degree of cultural issues, corporate cultural issues that are repressing employees' expressions, contributions, experimentations, and initiatives. I'm going to show you part of a video that I think illustrates the point I'm trying to make. It's not an outlier video, because you find this sort of thing happening surprisingly often in different countries, in different different categories across different parts of Asia. And it's extremely important to understand the implications. So this is an article I wrote for the Business Times, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, and it basically highlighted the implications of something that had happened at a bank. Essentially, people being disciplined. I'll use the word with inverted commas for not delivering against business goals. So I'll let the TVC run, and it'll give you an idea of the point I'm trying to make.
Hello and welcome. You're watching One India News and I'm Pooja Fachdeva. This is a shocking video that is going viral. This video shows a Chinese bank manager publicly abusing and shaming their employees for not completing their targets. He especially invited them on stage to harass them. But what you see next will actually shock you. He literally thrashed his employees and spanked them on their butts and did not even leave the female employees. You can see the manager hitting his employees hard on the back. The video of this unfortunate incident leaked online on Sunday, sparking an outrage against the bank. According to People's Daily Facebook post, 8 employees who work at the Rural Commercial Bank in North China's Jiangxi province were reprimanded by their manager for not exceeding themselves. The manager begins by explaining the reasons behind his employees' poor performance and then moves behind.
Whoops. Okay, so I think most people get the idea behind what's happening here, and I don't think there's any need to. Sorry.
Hello and welcome. You're watching One India News and I'm Pooja Fachdeva. This is a shocking video that is going viral. This video shows a Chinese bank manager publicly abusing. Hello and welcome. You're watching One India News
We're having a bit of trouble here. Let me just.
This is a shocking video that is going viral.
time. So innovation then becomes a casualty of the process. What you just saw a moment ago is not necessarily, it's not even repression of opinion. It's actually a physical act, and it's not necessarily limited to certain countries like China. It's something that happens on a reasonable basis in some parts of the region. So why is it happening? And what is the impact of all of this? I think that the absence of inclusive, enabling cultures undermines the brand's ability or brands' abilities to appeal to consumers and the ability of a company to innovate. I was involved in a multitude of different brand audits on behalf of my clients for a number of years. And essentially, the research was very conclusive over a period of 10 years in terms of how employees related to their positions at work, in terms of attitudes to meaningful work, was low opportunity for growth, low trust in leadership, low willingness to take risk, and low willingness to collaborate. So we go back to this great paradox. With all of this still happening, how is it that Asia continues to emerge and to punch above its weight? Well, part of the answer here lies in the other Asia. You know, Asia is essentially redefining itself. There is a widespread sentiment of openness, progress, pragmatism, and a growing sense of optimism and local pride that's beginning to sweep across the region at a rate that is really not comparable to, say, even 10 years ago. There is a new sense of hope and optimism in the region, and a lot of it's to do with the wave that's being created by the younger generation. I think what companies in Australia and other parts of the world can look at principally is really local talent. These very people that in some companies are in fact, I think, being discouraged from expressing themselves and contributing in a material way are the very resources that some of the stronger agents, some of the stronger companies are in fact exploiting. So local talent equals essentially massive opportunities for companies that understand the importance and the need to inspire them to address some of those needs. At the same time, we don't talk only about the drivers of businesses, employees. We talk about also consumers, and consumer expectations are definitely changing. When we talk about corporate responsibility and more and relevancy, as we talked about earlier in earlier slides, Asia is certainly leading, and in more ways, and in some ways, surprisingly so. Asian consumers expect more from companies and brands. We're now finding the research is difficult to challenge. It's coming from different corners, from different categories. But we now find that people in most countries, and obviously there are differences between emerging, developing, and developed markets, we find that increasingly the expectation of Asian consumers are changing. But Asia is obviously not monolithic. There's very heavy local regulation in every market, and we need to be operating and understanding and operating at a much more local level, which makes the whole effort a great deal more difficult. Every market is figuring its own way. China is different from Japan, which is different from Indonesia again. So while brands have permission to play a more substantial role, they need to have a deeper local understanding of people and culture of the markets that they wish to operate in. Exporting opportunities will require an appreciation of the different cultures. Asia is not monolithic, but principally against this one thing that's emerging as a commonality, this idea that people's lives are important and making brands relevant to their lives and overall improving the world around them is becoming a massively hot issue for people. Some headlines in terms of some of the different countries' expectations you might expect in Asia. China, creativity is absolutely paramount. It's seen as a non-negotiable element. Creativity is recognized as a force of improvement for particularly young Chinese youth and incremental progress. It's not seen as a disruption as it's often seen in the West. So it's extremely important. It's the number one driver of success in China, and it's outranked issues like trustworthy and other elements since 2015. The country is embracing a whole bunch of things that we are coming to grips with in the West, and things and stereotypical notions are in fact breaking down. The country is embracing, for instance, artificial intelligence in a very, very big way across such areas as access control, customized recommendations, surveillance of city solutions. In Shenzhen, where I visited a couple of times a year ago at the Fushan station, commuters can now scan faces on a tablet-sized screen mounted on interest gates and have the fare automatically deducted from linked accounts. Sorry. The other important thing I think it's probably also worthwhile making is if you're trying to understanding consumer behavior in China, more than any other country, there is a shift from search-based shopping to recommendation shopping, and that's huge. Influencer marketing in Asia, particularly China, is massive. You look at Kuaishou, which is a platform for recording with millions of original fresh videos being played every day. It's one of the local apps. During Kaishu's e-commerce festival last year, the top influencer that has 40 million followers on the platform sold around 7.2 million worth of goods within 3 hours. That's how important that is. Brands or products that in the past were seen as copycats, like, for instance, WeChat, transitioning aggressively into innovators and super apps. WeChat today fuels the everyday life and culture of Chinese people. And whilst it was created in the absence of Western social media platforms, it is now widely seen as best in class in China and certainly in the region. So while all of these developments are taking place, at the same time, quality of life expectations by the Chinese people are also increasing. It's not a secondary role anymore as it might have been 10 years ago. Yes, 76% of people are looking for the next big thing compared to lower percentages in the West. But as I mentioned, quality of life expectations are shifting dramatically. These are images from CNN not so long ago, perhaps 2 years ago, and they basically illustrate some of the problems that, social problems that are being encountered in the big cities, in particular in China. And for the Chinese leadership, social unrest is a key issue that needs to be avoided at all costs. So work towards addressing or mitigating social concerns and addressing social causes and social issues is becoming a priority in Asia, only because it's a practical thing to do. So to just conclude, as far as China is concerned, brands that navigate the nuance and take on behavior of disruptive brands are the ones that are rising to the fore of consumer minds in China. But brands will also need to look deeply at local issues, universal values, and work out meaningful solutions, not just general or generic campaigns. Indonesia, today, very different from it was even 5 years ago. Hectic, dynamic, busy, crowded, ambitious, increasingly loyal to its own brands. So there is a sense, very much like China, of increased pride in its own products. Gojek is a good example. It's an illustrative example of a brand that's is breaking frontiers and moving at the speed of sound. It's become a verb in Indonesia, Gojek. It isn't uncommon to hear the phrase "Let's Gojek" in Jakarta. And locals say that the brand has adapted to the spirit of the city, as I mentioned earlier, dynamic, busy, crowded, ambitious. The brand continuously experiments across media touchpoints, has a great deal of multiple brand stories, which again provides a case study for companies that are looking to work in Indonesia, and they dominate the mind space. So this idea of familiarity to Indonesians and consistent positive experiences is creating an element of high trust for Indonesians. And that's important because there's been a great deal of distrust that has generated over the last few years in that country. Japan is important for a whole variety of reasons. One of the key things that continues to dominate businesses done there is that enduring preference for local brands. Reflects a great long-standing belief in the quality people have for their own brands in Japanese products. Although it varies from category to different category, there is an element of consumer ethnocentrism on local brand preference. In other words, people see themselves, Japanese people see themselves in Japanese brands. Thailand, in the midst of growing distrust of its media, its government, honesty is increasingly valued highest from brands, followed by responsibility and trustworthiness. Thai consumers are looking at having their country elevate itself, make it better, particularly improve the lot of its lower class, destitute class in urban and country areas. 86% of people in Thailand prefer brands that promote their country compared to lower percentages in the rest of APAC. Singapore is a very interesting country. I spent 18 years living in Singapore. It's by far, with possible exception of Hong Kong, the most affluent, developed, progressive country in Asia. It's gone from having material possessions to now beginning to value people and relationships. They also value satisfaction, happiness, all the things that are probably as relevant to Westerners as you might expect. But they've also essentially are worried about losing the gains they've made over the last 10, 20, 30 years. So in Singapore, there is this mindset of being prepared for the worst that probably works well with companies addressing local consumer segments. To do well, brands to reassure people. More than 50% of 16 to 25-year-olds are expressing a desire to make social differences, for companies to make social differences, not just the presumption of money. Now, South Korea obviously is an important and massively developing juggernaut on its own. South Korea has a few striking statistics of its own. For instance, 94% of the country's 15 million active users on Facebook have mobile access. The country is also the biggest producer of massively multiplayer online role-playing games. And yet, there is a malaise that is affecting people, from students to workers across all levels of the country. Students in South Korea rank the lowest in satisfaction OECD countries. They suffer from stress and overwork and similar ailments. Young professionals, the situation is not much better. So there is, in contrast, there is a visible, palpable rise of social change that is being demanded by people in Korea, as well as social conscious marketing. Hong Kong, there are a lot of things I could say about Hong Kong, but the one thing that's probably most relevant, particularly right now, is this idea that Hong Kong is simply not the same as China. And that's probably the single most important thing that companies need to recognize if they want to do business successfully in Hong Kong. Because the internet in Hong Kong isn't censored, people can still access Facebook, Twitter, and other popular Western social media platforms. That's why when it comes to social media content, Facebook is the top social media platform used by Hong Kong consumers. Now, if you look at the images here, and you begin to understand just how important social discourse is in Hong Kong, on June 16th, 2 million Hong Kongers, more than a quarter of the population, moved to the streets and in unprecedented show of solidarity against the extradition issue that Beijing was trying to impose on Hong Kong. So you begin to understand the mindset and mentality there. And yes, moving away from countries and headlines, yes, digital continues to be important, and content continues to be king, as it's proclaimed and maintained by most practitioners in most countries. But it's probably also important to recognize a couple of things that is impacting the influence and the importance of digital. Like everywhere else, ad fatigue is rampant on digital platforms, and brands need to properly engage consumers instead of just getting eyeballs. And that is particularly true in Asia. 4 things, actually, I'd like to say as far as digital is concerned. I think the first is, developing a proper digital voice is going to be extremely important. What does that mean? It means a number of things. Visually attractive ads obviously do, in fact, deliver attention. But it's not just those. I think it's important to recognize that marketing campaigns need to be humanized, or to have an element of humanity to be truly impactful. So to retain attention, brands need to have a voice that sounds the same across all platforms, that strengthen brand identity, but also come across as understanding the needs of local people. And the key word here is humanized. The second point is really about communities. Community-based marketing is like word-of-mouth marketing, and we know how important that is in markets like China. It's organic, it's trustworthy. When it happens on a digital platform, it obviously grows like wildfire. Through community, brands have a personal feedback loop on their products and services, and engagement will help the product development and product loyalty amongst consumers. The third element I wanted to talk about is the importance of micro-influencers, and that's pretty straightforward. Micro-influencers are more likely to bring higher engagement rates and returns. We saw the impact of Kaisho and micro-influencers in China, obviously bigger markets. But overall, the fourth point is probably the most important. Powerful brands are moving from what we talked about, that all-important content, to context now. And that's critical, and it ties back to this idea that brands are more relevant. What do I mean by context? So the big change is shifting content to context. And I'll explain context through a quote by the chairman and CEO of BBDO, India, when I spoke to him actually earlier this year, as I was interviewing him for my PhD dissertation, trying to understand brand purpose construct. And he said to me, context is king, but context is King Kong. This is what he had to say, and it probably deserves it to be read verbatim. He said, when we look for us, it's really about going under the skin of advertising and looking at where is this guy, woman, or whatever, living in what conditions. Can those conditions be discussed along with what the product or the brand has to offer? We find that the people are more interested in their condition rather than what the brand has to offer. They want the brand offering to be connected to their condition. That condition can be very personal, it can be very social, it can be very cultural. It can be political, it can be religious. In that environment, it's that environment which allows for a dialogue. It's the context that allows for a dialogue. So what he's basically saying is essentially that we need to understand what's happening in the lives of consumers today. Because brand has a role now that it did not necessarily have 30 years ago, because the circumstances 30 years ago were different. So this is a very nuanced understanding, but extremely important understanding of what's happening on the ground and how brands essentially need to behave to become relevant or to stay relevant. So that's the common denominator. What is the common denominator? Well, the important thing that comes out of all of the things that I mentioned earlier about those headlines in different countries, and they shift and they differ, but the number one thing that probably is consistent and common to all is this idea that by far everybody wants brands to do is make business more environmentally sustainable. So make sure that brands are behaving in a responsible way. And I'm not just talking about CSR, because CSR doesn't have neither the the power nor the measurement to actually be sensibly tracked and used. I'm more talking about this construct of brand purpose in a way that makes a brand relevant in the lives of people, which is the situational context that I want to touch on right now. So, there are different definitions of what brand purpose is. It is a construct that is the centerpiece of my PhD study. I've been working on this for the past 3 years because it has influenced my thinking over the last 10 years. For those of you who are possibly still unfamiliar with the construct, it is probably the single most dynamic aspect or dynamic idea that is impacting the marketing environment in a very polarizing way, I may say. There are people that champion the construct, and there are very, very strong detractors, and both have very credentialed individuals on both sides. But if there was one thing that commonly defines the construct in a sea of different definitions, is this idea that the purpose of brands is to improve people's lives. That brands need to have conviction, they need to know why they exist, and they need to share that passion. Now, this is actually quite a big deal, the idea that they have conviction, because forever and a day, brands, the conventional wisdom was that brands needed to be impartial, they needed to be neutral. They did not participate in politically charged or opinionated, or provide opinionated views on things. That began to change as early as what, 30 years ago with Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Until today, Ben & Jerry's expresses its opinion, whether it's political, in terms of supporting the Democratic Party in the United States, or with social issues like LGBTQ and its wide support for it. Obviously, there are a lot of companies that are very concerned about taking those positions. But what we're finding right now is that landscape has changed so dramatically that brands are having little room to maneuver. They have the need, there is an increased need to take a position. And obviously that means also that consumers will react accordingly. So purpose is now, brand purpose is shifting the conversation from what products does or do in terms of its physical features and its ability to address certain issues to what a brand means. And it's important to also provide a caveat at this point. It doesn't mean that product benefits are no longer important. On the contrary, they've become hygiene factors. They've become a given. They're the things that you must do before you move on to providing a reason for helping people. Now, before I go on to the gap between what people expect and how many companies are addressing that, it's also probably important to state that as important as brand purpose is right now with practitioners and companies, and one of the biggest advocates of brand purpose is Unilever. They've bet their future on brand purpose. All brands now are being given a purpose. It's important also to state that the construct is very, very ill-defined right now, which is the subject of my work. There are many definitions. And as I said earlier on, the only common element is improving people's lives. But there are, the definitions are so wide that they are impacting the ability of companies to do things properly. And that, in fact, creates also certain amounts of risks for companies that engage in brand purpose and those that don't. But in terms of overall importance, globally and in Asia as well, 65% of consumers are saying that they want companies to support strong purposes, and yet 45% of consumers, only 45% of consumers can actually name a company. So we have a 20% gap there, which shows the importance of closing that gap. Trust is down, expectations are up. In 2017, net trust in global companies to act in the best interests of society was negative. And while 2/3, 65% of consumers want to support a company, as I mentioned, only 45% of them can actually identify. Now, Asia is no different. On the contrary, there is enough evidence to suggest that in many, many cases, the trends are even stronger, and for reasons that are not necessarily the same as the West. It's not because it's the right thing to do, it's the important thing to do, it is a pragmatic thing to do. Countries like China illustrate this. So in Asia, consumers are positively disposed, strongly so, to brands that do good, a great deal more than most Western companies actually recognize. Global brands have the power to make things better, according to 45% of APAC consumers surveyed. And things are already changing in significant ways in Asia. As I mentioned earlier on, there is no one single way to define or to do brand purpose. How do you actually transition your brand strategy away from one that's revolved around brand positioning to one that incorporates or substitutes it with brand purpose? What the evidence is suggesting is that there are different ways to doing it, although they haven't been codified yet. And this is a good example of how purpose has ramped up attention to a brand, making it number one in India. Some of you might be familiar with Lifebuoy. We don't have Lifebuoy in Australia or in some Western markets, but it is a brand that is dominating the soap category in India. Its reason for being is simply the idea that sanitation is important and that no lives should be lost through the lack of sanitation. It's run a number of different brand purpose campaigns, but the central idea revolves around children, and has since the inception of the brand, or the launch of the brand decades ago. And that idea has catapulted the brand to number one. And I'll show you the execution. I think it's extremely self-explanatory. It provides you with an understanding of how brand purpose can be so powerful and push a brand to number one.
கண்ணுக்கு கண்ணால தாழ்ந்த தப்பில்லை துள்ளி விளையாடியே மனதை மகிழச் செய்யணுங்க மகிழச் செய்யணுங்க மகிழச் செய்யணுங்க தெய்வம் தந்த செல்வமையா நான் பெற்ற செல்வமையா ஆரோக்கியமும் அறிவும் பெற்று வளர்ந்துட்டானையா மனம் மகிழ்ந்தோம் ஐயா நாமே மனம் மகிழ்ந்தோம் ஐயா இந்த மகிழ்ச்சியின் வேதனை எதுவும் மறந்திடும் ஐயா ஐயா நான் ஒரு மேனியும் பொழுதொரு வண்ணம் என் மகன் வளருகிறான் உள்ளங்களிலே இன்பம் பெருகிட மனதில் இறைகின்றான் மனதில் இறைகின்றான் मेरा बच्चा 5 साल का हो गया।
इतना सब 5 साल में कौन सी बड़ी बात है?
बड़ी बात है मैडम, ये गुंडप्पा का पहला बच्चा है जो 5 साल की उम्र तक पहुंचा है।
क्या?
That video there was viewed by, at the time, 19 million people. I think that, to the best of my knowledge, that number is actually double. What's interesting about this particular execution is that it demonstrates how brand purpose actually has replaced positioning entirely. It's not always the case, but this particular approach for Lifebuoy now has made the #1 brand in India. I can just move on without reinitiating the slide. And there are multiple campaigns that have been created in other third world countries, particularly Africa, that have the same end effect with the brand. What I'm going to do now, I wanted to also share a couple of other examples. I'm going to run through it because I'm noticing that we're running short of time. REL, again, a low interest, high package volume goods that otherwise wouldn't necessarily address a great deal of consumer attention, is now a massive point of discussion. It's created that movement that we talked about earlier on, simply by recognizing that gender equality is in fact part of the brand's scope. Sharing the load is not just about sharing the washing load, but sharing also a great number of other responsibilities between men and women in parts of India, in Asia, and particularly India. So I won't go through that now. We don't have the time for that. I thought actually I had closed those slides. I won't be going through the case study. I think I'm just going to wrap up now to allow for some questions, if any.
Sure. Thank you, Joseph, for that great presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them to the Q&A tab, and let's wait a couple of seconds.
Yeah, I'll just close this off with a couple of reminders about what makes the region important. A few things. In a region steeped with profound cultural mindsets, we talked about patriarchal and hierarchical management sets. Dynamic change is changing the consumers, the expectations both of consumers as well as employees in Asia. The #1 goal most people have in the region is to make business more environmentally sustainable. And part and parcel with that is the idea that brands need to be more relevant in the lives of people as well.
All right, the questions have been pouring in, so let's get into them. Under the first question, how prevalent is brand purpose becoming in Asia?
Well, right now, it's now becoming part of the agenda of most, certainly entrepreneurial companies, the younger companies that are moving, but some of the packaged good companies are taking their lead from Unilever. Unilever has made a massive statement by committing all of its business to more sustainable or sustainability issues and sustainability responsibilities that essentially forces the competition to follow suit. So in Asia, it's becoming very, very prevalent.
Excellent. So the second question, is brand purpose sufficiently developed as a construct for effective use by companies?
No, it's not. And this is the interesting and important thing about this great discussion that's happening. As I said, it's a very, very controversial construct that has polarized the marketing community. It's not something that is below the radar. It's something that's big, as attested by both Unilever, Procter & Gamble, and some of the other major packaged good companies that are in fact making significant commitments to it. And yet we find an environment where the definition is still undecided on. There is no consensus on definition. In fact, my PhD research study is surprisingly the first such study that's going to empirically explore the construct, provide a definitional frame of reference for it, and also explain how to operationalize it. So that's one of the things that's happening right now.
Right. Our next question, how do you reconcile, for example, China's need for creativity with a culture which is one of a high power distance nature?
Yeah, the reconciliation lies essentially in the resistance of younger generations. You find that a younger generation that haven't been brought up in the same environment that their parents were, we're not that far away in terms of time from the Cultural Revolution. So you find the newer generations that are being born in a more affluent China, their expectations are in fact changing. You see a version of that happening in Hong Kong, although that's not really China, as we all know. But you have an entrepreneurial new generation that's emerging, particularly in the urban cities of China, that are expecting different things and feel they're enabled, and they feel they have the resources and the empowerment to do so. And it's been recognized by, I think, by government as well.
Right. I think we have time for one more question. Why are some companies rushing to the construct and others hesitating?
Because that's an important question, actually, given what's being betted on brand purpose. There is risk involved. There are a couple of different risks involved. The first is not understanding the construct. There are a lot of companies that simply believe that it's easy to engage in brand purpose, and you say a few things and hope for the best. And what happens is that this gap between understanding what the construct is and what needs to be done then manifests itself. And what happens is that there is a greenwashing effect in some cases where consumers cease to believe in what the brand does. So instead of actually progressing the brand forward, providing it with credentials or reasons for people to buy into the brand, it actually delivers the opposite. People become very, very resentful. So there are companies that are engaging in that, and there are other companies that actually recognize the complexity of engaging in a brand purpose effort, a brand purpose initiative, because just a superficial understanding of the construct immediately tells you that significant structural change is required within the organization before you can actually go out externally to customers. So this idea of investment is big. And is in fact making some companies hesitate.
All right, thank you, Joseph. So looks like we're now out of time for further questions, and thank you everyone for attending and for your wonderful questions, and thank you, Joseph, again for the great presentation. Please look out for the recording, which will email through to you in the next couple of days, and thanks again for joining us, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.